Hello there. So Gary is on vacation, but who can replace him as the grifter in chief? Well, I nominate this dude. This is Richard Murphy, who is an accounting professor at Sheffield University. And I swear it's not intentional that they're all British. This island just has the highest grifter density in the world. I don't know why. Anyway, so Richard is going to tell us about the Laffer curve and how it is secretly responsible for inequality. Why does everything with these people always boil down to inequality, you ask? I have no idea, but it always does. But before we can get into why I think that Richard should have stuck with accounting and not ventured out into economics, we actually need to cover what the Laffer curve is. And I'm just going to let Richard explain it because he does a decent job on that part.
We've got government revenue going up the y-axis, that's the vertical, and we've got the tax rate going along the horizontal axis, that's the x-axis. And the tax rate runs from 0% to 100%. And in Arthur's worldview, there was this nice even curve. If tax rates were below the optimal rate, which is the dashed line, then you could increase tax rates and get more revenue. And if taxes were above the optimal tax rate, you had to cut taxes because you would actually raise more money as a consequence of cutting them. That was what he said. Laffer's logic was simple. Higher taxes, he said, discourage work and enterprise, and beyond the optimal tax rate, people avoid taxes, evade taxes, or simply stop working altogether.
So this is a pretty good explanation of the Laffer curve. And if this doesn't seem like a groundbreaking economic finding to you, that's because it isn't. What the Laffer curve is really just a simple visualization or a simple tool to explain the counterintuitive result that sometimes when you raise your tax rate, your tax revenue can actually decrease or at least not increase as much as you had thought it would. So just to be clear, this isn't an economic model that on its own can tell you what your taxes should be or whether or not you should increase taxes or lower taxes. It's just a component or a tool that's used in much more complex and fleshed out models. So now that we got the explanation out of the way, what actually are Richard's problems with the Laffer curve?
And the point I made then, and which I repeat now, is that the data shows there is no revenue maximizing tax rate in most economies.
So Arthur makes the point that the tax revenue maximizing tax rate doesn't actually exist for most economies. And that's not actually a terrible point. I just don't think Arthur understands it. So as I mentioned before, the Laffer curve is a really simple qualitative tool. You can't really simply apply it to entire economies. If you try and you have complex models of the economies, it actually can end up that you don't get a smooth curve, but you rather get a more discontinuous function, and so you can't easily just find a maximum. And the fact that you can't easily find the maximizing rate doesn't mean that the structure behind it doesn't still resemble a curve or that there isn't tax rates that are better than others in terms of revenue. And the reason that I think Arthur doesn't understand this point or is just intentionally leaving out the nuance behind it is because about a minute later in the video, he actually says this.
The actual evidence from academic research is that the tipping point rate inside most economies is around 70% overall tax rate. But in most economies like the UK, the actual effective tax rate is between 35 and 40%.
Here Richard goes from saying that there is no revenue maximizing tax rate to saying there is one and it's actually around 70%. And this is kind of doubly impressive because not only does that completely invalidate his previous criticism of this rate not existing supposedly, but also for him to use it as an argument that current taxes are much lower than where they would optimally be, you kind of have to believe in the whole concept of the Laffer curve, which Richard supposedly doesn't. The entire point of the video is that the Laffer curve is wrong. And on top of everything, this whole Laffer curve thing is usually applied to a specific tax rate, like income taxes, for example. But Richard just calls it the overall tax rate. What's the overall tax rate, Richard? But let's be serious here for a minute, because economists do actually try and estimate all this stuff. In a literature summary called Taxing the Super Rich by Scheuer and Slemrod, they estimate that the top US marginal income tax bracket should be around 57 to 70%. So at least numbers-wise, it doesn't seem like Richard is too far off. But of course they are talking about the top income tax bracket, which is a marginal tax, whereas Richard, at least with his 35 to 40% figure, was definitely talking about effective tax rates. The difference there is that a marginal tax rate is only applied to income over a certain amount, whereas the effective tax is, as the name implies, what you effectively pay over your entire income. Just to be clear, absolutely no one would argue for a 70% effective tax rate. But I'm starting to suspect that Richard doesn't really care about whether or not what he's saying is correct or not, because at another point in the video he makes the following argument.
And anyway, Scandinavian countries disprove Arthur's claim. High taxes have been equated to strong growth. Look right across Europe and look at the countries which are seeing much higher rates of productivity than the UK and much higher rates of growth, and they've got higher taxes too.
Let's talk about this graph for a bit, because I don't think it shows what Richard wants it to show. If we take a look at the top 3 highest labor productivity countries, number 1, Ireland, has a massively inflated labor productivity because of the fact that it is a tax haven. Norway is a petro state, which is hardly comparable to any other state in Europe. And Switzerland, which has the 3rd highest labor productivity, is not exactly known for its high taxes. Quite the contrary, actually. Both Switzerland and Ireland are actually quite commonly referred to as tax havens within Europe. So don't get me wrong, I don't think these are bad countries. They certainly do a lot of things right, but high taxes is not what they are known for, and I don't think it's what makes them great or efficient countries. The second thing, and maybe this is not taught in accounting, but correlation is not causation. At its best, if we just concede to Richard that this graph is actually showing what he thinks it is showing, then we still couldn't say from this that high taxes cause high growth or high labor productivity. It could also just be the other way around, or it could be completely unrelated. This entire graph could, in best case scenario, just show correlations, and I don't think it even does that. Lastly, and this isn't really like a super academically rigorous point, but I'm just really curious how all of this works out in Richard's mind, because if raising taxes was so good for the economy, then it would also increase government revenue. And raising government revenue is really in the interest of government. So eventually a government would figure out that, that's probably a good thing to do. Even if you think that all the governments are like the most corrupt people ever, raising revenue would give them more funds to be corrupt with. So imagine eventually they would be like, we keep raising taxes and it just keeps making us richer because we can siphon more of the taxpayer money away. But in Richard's mind, in every government around the world, every country, there must be at least some person who is just completely and utterly ideologically committed to keeping taxes low. They're going like, no, we cannot raise taxes, even if it's good for all of us cronies here in the government. They must remain low. I don't know how he thinks this entire system would make sense. The people in charge of taxes want them to be high, so they have more money. They would raise them eventually if it was good for everybody. I don't get it. Anyway, at this point, Richard just pivots into modern monetary theory, or MMT as it's called, to explain some of his more out there points. Maybe we'll eventually get around to making a full video on MMT, because there's definitely a lot of wild stuff there. But for now, let's just go on with some of the wilder things that he says in this video.
But now we know that taxes don't fund the government. Government money creation funds the government, and tax plays an entirely different role in the economy now that we have what are called fiat currencies that only have value because the government makes them legal tender. And in that situation, tax is used to recover from the economy the money that the government has spent into existence through its spending programs.
If this all sounded very confusing to you, that's good, because that's probably a really healthy reaction to hearing about MMT. But let's actually break down what he's saying here. His main point here is that government doesn't actually need taxes to fund its operations. And putting it this way is obviously quite nonsensical for multiple reasons. The first one is that in the developed world, generally money creation is separate from the government. This is what's usually called central bank independence. The government, or the reigning party, doesn't actually control how much money is created. This is done by an independent body called the central bank. And the created money also doesn't go to the government to spend. This would obviously be a huge conflict of interest. The second reason, this is a quite strange way to look at it, is that the government in its operation obviously uses real resources. So when the government builds a highway, for example, it obviously still needs to get the asphalt. And when it runs a food assistance program, it still needs to get the food from somewhere. The government does this through various taxes, and the fact that they are done through currency, so through the pound or the dollar, is really just a detail. The government could just as well just go to farmers and tell them, hey, I need 10% of your food production. In fact, this has happened historically, for example, under feudalism, where peasants were expected to pay in kind. So that means they were giving part of their harvest or livestock or paid in labor. However, like many things, it's just a lot simpler to do this with currency and not with individual labor output, especially in complex modern economies. But let's just disregard the facts for a bit and assume we're actually living in Richard's world, where the government actually does create its own money directly and uses it to fund its own operations. Well, the Laffer curve logic still applies, because in this case, creating money is very similar to a tax. When the government creates money, it obviously devalues the rest of the currency that's in circulation. And who is holding that currency? Usually it would be your population. So by devaluing their currency and creating new currency in the government's possession, what you're doing essentially is again a transfer from the population to the government. The same logic of the Laffer curve applies, because when you start creating money like crazy, so essentially you're devaluing a currency a lot, people will just stop holding currency, and then it eventually loses its value, and your revenues, which in this case come from money creation, go down again. So the Laffer curve still applies and you're still subject to the same constraints essentially. Anyway, this weird way of viewing government finances that Richard has leads him to conclude all kind of weird things like the following.
Because if tax is not paid out of private sector money, the euphemistic taxpayers' money that politicians always talk about, but which doesn't actually exist, because all the money that is used to pay tax was created by the government in the first place, then this idea that the capacity to pay has a direct impact upon the willingness to work doesn't hold.
So taxpayer money doesn't exist because the government created it in the first place. I'm not even sure where he's going with this. I'm not sure how the conclusion follows from this premise. And even the premise is a bit incoherent. It's like saying the banana in my kitchen doesn't exist because it was produced by some farmer in Ecuador. I'm really not sure what he wants us to conclude from this. Anyway, Richard goes on for quite a while about MMT and about how the Laffer curve was used to justify inequality and tax competition, but I think this video has been long enough. To conclude, I really just want to say that I think Richard's attack on the Laffer curve is really misguided. The Laffer curve itself, which is really just the idea that taxes can have behavioral changes in the individuals that you're taxing, is so simple it's almost unimpeachable. And to be fair here, I think you can make a really strong argument that the concept of the Laffer curve has been misused by politicians and probably even by Arthur Laffer himself. But the idea behind it is really solid and it goes back far longer than Arthur Laffer. In the end, Richard just completely refuses to acknowledge that the world isn't black and white out there and there's actually hard trade-offs to be made. Richard keeps on insisting that raising taxes to a much higher level is actually good for everyone and everything, and there's absolutely no drawback to be had there, and expects us to believe that the solution is actually this simple. In the end, it's quite obvious that he can't actually economically justify any of this, as you've seen in this video, but ultimately I guess it doesn't really matter to his viewers. Anyway, that's basically it. So if you made it to here, then I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you had any questions, or you thought we got something wrong, or thought we were being unfair to Richard, then put it in the comments. I'm always happy to read it. See you in the next one.